You are listening to E-Radio by Missed Apex. We are electric. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the E-Radio Show, produced by Missed Apex Podcast. I'm Matt Trumpets, and today's episode is brought to you by Matt Ragsdale and the City Line Trio. Today's episode is called Throw the Form Book Out the Window, and joining me today to take apart the Formula E weekend in excruciating detail is Chris C. Stevens Journo. Stevens, how are we doing today, Chris?
Yeah, great. I'm all recovered from a couple of all-nighters writing about Formula E at the weekend.
Yeah, they did give you a little bit. They give you just a wee bit to talk about, just a hint of controversy and excitement.
I mean, I heard it was just really, really boring for most people. I don't think this is going to take us very long at all.
Well, excellent. Well, how about we bring on our guest today, Ryan Ferris. How are we doing today, Ryan?
I'm doing brilliant, thanks, Matt.
Wonderful. Well, let's get right to it.
Big Dirty News.
Well, so apparently there was news. It was exciting enough. We've delayed talking about the actual race weekend. So what is it, Steven? Spit it out.
Yes, so there was breaking news at the weekend that Sao Paulo is going to be delayed until 2019. Of course, that was one of the 3 new races that was going to be for this season's calendar. So it was due to take place in it was March or April, I forget off the top of my head. But that is going to be delayed. And the theory at the moment is that the old Punta del Este track is going to be taking its spot.
Well, now, first of all, is it really a shocker something in Brazil has been delayed? And secondly, are we confirmed with the Punta del Este, or is that just like the talk of the paddock, as it were?
That is, it may as well be confirmed. They're getting ready to host an ePrix, put it this way. And I mean, the reason that we've got this Sao Paulo delay, the official reason is to do with privatization of the land in which the circuit is being constructed, and that isn't complete yet. It was sold quite recently, and the privatization is not quite complete. But I think there are obviously people were talking about the events of what happened while the Formula One Grand Prix was there, and that is probably a contributing factor.
Right, because we would be talking about a street race in this instance and not one that was at a dedicated circuit. Although, to be fair, my wife did spend a month in Sao Paulo and didn't have any real problems, so it is possible. Punta del Este, this is like one of Formula E's favorite tracks, is it not?
Yeah, I loved it. It was a really great track, very challenging. It's provided us with a couple of great races in the first 2 seasons of Formula E, so if we do go back, I'd be very happy about that.
Well, brilliant. What say we get on to the race weekend? All right, so before we begin with the actual events of the weekend, tell us who were your winners and losers? Who really, because this is our first weekend back, and it's a doubleheader. So we had lots of expectations going into it. Coming out of last season, we had Renault, we had Abt up at the front, we had the massive battle between Buemi and Degrassi, we had Mahindra making some strides. And so you've come to the first weekend. How did it all pan out? Who were the winners of the weekend, do you think?
Okay, the big winner for me, it's got to be Eduardo Mortara. In his first weekend, he very nearly won a race, which is just... It's unprecedented. The only person I can, think of outside of, the first weekend in of Formula E ever was, John-Eric Verne, the only other person to challenge for a win on his debut. And for him to have come into an extremely challenging sport and so nearly taken that win, especially when you consider how some of the other rookies struggled. And given Venturi's previous season, where they were very low in the Constructors' Championship in the end. And it was just an incredible performance. Especially, and let's give credit to all the rookies as well, because radio interference was the talk of the drivers. And so they were basically doing their races solo between, occasionally being able to talk to their engineer.
Well, that sounds like a bit of a challenge, doesn't it, Ryan?
Well, yeah, it does. And I think, we did see quite good race weekend from Montaro. I mean, he had an all right first race. In fact, Jaguar with PK seemed to have a good first race as well.
I mean, what's the biggest thing about Formula E that drivers tend to struggle with, as well as, just the overall handling of the car? It's the energy management and handling that regen, especially because it affects the braking balance, corner by corner during a race. And that's where your communication with the race engineer becomes so critical. So for that to be, in and out during the whole race weekend, that just made life difficult for everyone, especially the rookies.
Yeah, it would have. But speaking of someone who is teamed with a rookie, Mortaro was not the only one to have a good weekend. Who else really stood out for you?
Sam Bird for me as well. That race 1 win, stunning, absolutely stunning. I've never seen. I say I've never seen a more dominant performance, being able to take a drive-through penalty and still win the race. But then suddenly some of Buemi's performances from last year, or earlier in the year, I should say, start flooding back to me. But that was definitely a very commanding win for the DS Virgin driver.
Indeed. So, anyone else stand out for you, teams or drivers that just really surprised you in terms of their performance?
Jaguar. It's got to be Jaguar. I mean, we knew they were going to struggle in their first season last season. You fully expect that. They're 2 years behind the mark on everyone else, and they have made a huge leap forward. And I said this going into the season that Jaguar were going to be the ones to make the biggest step forward. They had the potential to be on pole in race 1, but this is where they also fall into the losers category. Is that it was a royal mess up that cost them that pole position, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later on.
I felt that Mahindra had a good weekend as well. Hofeld could have won the race if he'd got in front of Verne sooner than he did. But, it's if, buts and maybes. And then you had Rosenquist in race 2 getting the pole, having his spin, but then doing a brilliant job at recovering.
But you see, the thing about Mahindra is that weekend could have been so much more, because if Nick hadn't got caught up in that battle for the podium, he'd have been right up there with Sam probably. And race 2, nobody wanted to win race 2, it seemed. The amount of errors is unprecedented. I think this was, they got very, very lucky in race 2 to have finished where they did. With Felix. Nick had some issues. I think there was a missed opportunity for Mahindra to score something massive.
Yeah, but compared to maybe some other teams that you might expect to do well, Mahindra at least seems to have carried over their momentum from the end of the season.
Oh, well, I was just, this is probably what you were about to say. This is where Renault and Audi come in.
I was going to say, and where there are winners, there must be losers. And we had a few of those as well, so... Take it away, Stephen.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, where do you start with Audi and Renault? They were the two favourites with Degrassi and Buemi coming into the season because they're the ones that are always at the front in Formula E. They put it down to their LMP1 experience. They're both very rich in that. They've both won a lot of races and titles in LMP1, and that's maybe why they're so good in Formula E. But I mean, just everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The pace wasn't quite there, it seemed, in qualifying. Buemi admitted he didn't take enough risks on his first qualifying lap for race 1, and then the car broke down in the race and crashing in qualifying in race 2, which just immediately, undoes everything. And Audi, this mystic race pace, this big advantage that they supposedly had. Everyone was talking about it, and, we all took this with a pinch of salt as well, because those times in testing, they're not always representative, because, Valencia, it's not like a Formula E track in any way, shape, or form, but it did still seem like Audi, when Audi came in, the whole point was that it was going to push the team even further forward, and it almost looks like they've taken a step back.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I would agree with you if we're focusing on Degrassi, though he did have the issues with his broken suspension on Saturday. But if we look at where Abt placed, I mean, certainly that demonstrates there's some potential in the car, if nothing else.
Definitely potential. The thing about Abt is that, he was promoted 2 positions on the grid. for that race. Now, granted, he didn't get a great Super Pole lap because he tapped the wall, so we don't really know where he would have qualified. But he was promoted by Mitch Evans having his time deleted in Super Pole 2, and by Sam Bird's grid penalty. And, those, again, we'll get into more detail about that later. But, when you consider everything that happened in that race, the Rosenqvist spin, the Mortara spin, don't get me wrong, that was a strong performance and he won that race. It wasn't other people losing it. He won that race. But there are still a lot of we've done 2 races and we still don't know what the grid is going to look like because frankly, I think 7 teams are capable of winning races.
Right. And that is one of the big attractions of Formula E, isn't it, Ryan?
Well, yeah, it definitely is. And, not many sports can boast the fact that you can have multiple winners, but it also helps the fact that it's, everyone's sort of in similar equipment. And that is what really helps with the racing.
Brilliant. What say we move on to the race breakdown? Okay, so take us through the weekend. Take us through race 1. Take us through the important bits. Where did this all come together and where did it all fall apart for the contenders at the sharp end?
First of all, for Jean-Eric Vergne, I do just have to praise the pole lap. I've always wanted to use the sort of expression, spins his way to pole position or something like that. And I finally got to use it. I was so happy about that. Because obviously, you could not recreate that in 1,000 tries. And he just spun at the exact right moment that it would be quicker for him as he crossed the timing beam. It was just a fantastic thing. But elsewhere in qualifying, we just mentioned Jaguar could have been on pole position in this race with Mitch Evans. He topped FP2 and also looked very competitive in free practice 1 as well. The surprise outside favourite for pole position, actually. And they sent him out too late. He missed the checkered flag to start his 200 kilowatt lap. And that is just amateur errors from a major team. I know they're only in their second season, but this is Jaguar we're talking about. They're one of the biggest OEMs in the world, and therefore they are capable of so much more. And the time that Evans ended up doing, that would have put him on top of group qualifying. So we can, it's difficult to then translate that into Super Pole because often we see very different results in Super Pole. But he certainly, it would have been top 5 rather than 20th. And Audi and Renault, as we mentioned, they weren't so competitive either, which was quite surprising. You had Audi down there in the 3rd and 4th row, Renault even further back, with Buemi only 9th. And I never called that Renault a fast car last year. I said it was an efficient car. It never, especially in the beginning of the season, it did not have qualifying pace. It had a race pace. But then, even that seems to have gone this season compared to their rivals.
Yeah, well, and especially compared to Techeetah, who uses the same powertrain. And this was a point of interest for me, seeing especially in the first race, even though I know, if I'm getting this correctly, that Vergne settings for the race weren't correct according to him, or they put him at a disadvantage compared to Bird.
Yeah, they were getting the strategy a little bit wrong. They were having some regen issues, some battery issues. So it's not really surprising to have seen Vergne slip so far. But just to give you an indication of how much he was struggling, there was about a 9-10 second gap between Vergne and Heidfeld before the pit stop phase, which, shortly after the pit stop, Heidfeld's managed to close that gap back up again. And I think only Vergne would have been able to keep that car in second place with slalom driving, as Nick Heidfeld called it.
Yes, he did not seem very happy about that kind of a tactic on Saturday, but he seemed perfectly willing to use that kind of a tactic on Sunday against Mortaro, didn't he? Oh, have I actually watched the race more closely than you? I love these moments when Stevens looks baffled. Right. So remember when Mortaro caught up to Heidfeld and was trying to lap him?
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. See, okay. Right.
And he was being chased by
I
Rosenquist at that point.
so confused for a second there, Trumpets. Yeah, though, he must have thought that was for position, surely, because I've never seen a lapped car defend so strongly.
Yeah, after he finally got by and in the pit stops, Heidfeld was actually trying to get back around him, which, you're entitled to do as a lap driver. You're entitled to unlap yourself. But nonetheless, it looked a lot like, to me, given that he was being chased by Rosenquist, that they were playing a team game there, and Heidfeld was acting the blocker for Rosenquist to try and back Mortaro up. Of course, that's because they didn't know that. Mortaro would eventually take himself out near the end of the race. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We're still talking about race 1. So what else do we need to know? How did it come about that Bird was in front? And man, what a gap he was able to pull both stints.
Well, I think Oliver Turvey played a big role in this race. He made an incredible start from 7th to 3rd. And basically had a traffic jam behind him for that entire first stint. Once again, the bad luck of Oliver Turvey. I know we had a question in our season preview about whether Turvey's luck would change. He would finally get a podium. So far, the answer is no, because he was running in 3rd place when the car shut down. And that really, really cost him, because he was driving an incredible race up until that point, keeping the likes of Abt and Degrassi and Boemi and Heidfeld behind him for a really, really long time. And that really allowed Bird and Verne, even with his problems, to create a big, big gap. And so really all Bird had to do was, keep ahead of Verne, and with Verne struggling, it wasn't going to be such an issue. The issues came in the pit lane when he locked up on a very dusty surface and wiped out some pick equipment and a crew member as well, which is never nice to see. And, of course, completed his pit stop outside of the garage, which is a bit of a no-no in terms of safety regulations. And he was given a drive-through penalty for that, but only lost 9 seconds, which is a little bit confusing, really, because, we were expecting him to come out in, 3rd, 4th, maybe 5th, and he still had the lead, just about. Very, very narrow gap it was in the end, but that was, the race was nearly lost at that point, but it was most definitely won when Turvey held up the majority of the pack and Verne started struggling.
Yeah, well, what struck me about Bird and the pit incident, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that he wasn't going too fast. He didn't get a speeding penalty in the pit lane. So the penalty, as I understood it, came about simply because his car did not make it into the pits. He was outside of his garage when he got out of it.
Yeah, it's a safety thing to, make sure that all the cars are in their garages, during the pit stop phase, so that, nobody comes in and has to drive around a car, for example, or, doesn't have to, take any avoiding action.
And that said, is this one of these, like I know they have in Formula One, is this one of these penalties that simply cannot be appealed?
I'm not too sure, really, and there's not really so much you can do with a drive-through. You've got to serve it. The interesting thing came, though, because I checked up a few other penalties, a few converted drive-through penalties that other drivers got for exceeding the power usage. So Rosenquist and Engel and there was somebody else. I don't know. It was just Rosenquist and Engel who exceeded the 180 kilowatt race power, and they were given a converted drive-through penalty to a time penalty of 22 seconds, which is more than double what Bird ended up losing in his drive-through. And so I can only assume there's been some massive miscalculation with the drive-through time loss.
Well, one thing that was pointed out was the fact that the pit lane was shorter than the actual track itself. So although you're going to lose time, you're not going to lose as much time because the distance you're travelling is shorter than if you were on track.
And this has happened before too. It happened in Formula One. I don't remember the incident, but I remember the shape of it, where somebody actually got a faster lap time because they entered the pits and it was such a shortcut.
It was Senna at Donington 93.
Or Schumacher did a similar thing at Silverstone when he had to serve a drive-through at the end of the race. He did it on the final lap and won the race because it cuts out a bit of the track, that pit lane entry.
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. Are all the pit lanes normally this short, or is this something that they're going to look at for the future? Did we hear any feedback from Formula E itself about this?
As far as I'm aware, it's the same as what it was last year. But obviously we didn't really have this issue last year, so I do think there is going to be a little bit more careful consideration as to how they design their pit lanes now, and make sure that there is a proper time loss, or at the very, very least, make sure that the converted drive-through time penalties are equal to that of an actual drive-through. Yeah,
that was exactly what I was wondering, but you haven't heard anything official. It just seems like that's what they ought to be doing.
No, nothing official yet.
All right, then. So anything else from this race that we want to talk about before we move on to part 2 of the weekend? Ryan?
Have we forgotten that we've had our first red flag in Formula E?
Yes, that's Andre Lotterer. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up because there's a lot to talk about with Andre Lotterer. What a dismal start to his Formula E career. It was a little bit silly, wasn't it, really? The crash that ended up happening, bouncing over curves, trying to avoid each other and just ending up on a wall. It looked a bit silly. And yeah, there was a bit of an issue with trying to reorganize the grid. And, you would expect this with, the first red flag in Formula E, especially because at first they didn't really know whether they should be on the grid, whether they should be in the pit lane. And then, there were some cars out of order. Mitch Evans was actually put back in the wrong spot, which the stewards very quickly apologized to Jaguar for. It did take a while, granted, yeah. But it's amazing we don't see red flags more often in Formula E, actual racing, given that, it's on tight street racing and it's as competitive as it is.
Well, I mean, I would ascribe that to the cars are built much more resiliently and the speeds are lower, so the energies are lower. So you're not going to get the same kind of damage you would if they were going, if they were going at Formula One speeds or IndyCar speeds.
I suppose, but did you see the exit of Turn 5? One tap on that ripped the rear end off of Prost's car.
Yeah, but I mean, they were going into like a Long Beach type hairpin or turn for that. It was Turn 2, correct?
No, I mean, Turn 5 where Mortara crashed in qualifying as well. Actually where Buemi crashed. But actually, just to get back onto Andre Lotterer, he picked up 4 penalties in his first race. He got a 5-second time penalty because a piece of cooling equipment wasn't taken off his car before the 3-minute board. And then he got 2 drive-through penalties for cutting the turn 3-4 chicane and not coming to a complete stop before rejoining the track, which they've been told to do. So that nobody gains an advantage by cutting that chicane. And then finally, he was disqualified for leaving his car in Parc Fermé in an unsafe mode. So, welcome to Formula E, Andre.
Is it called something like prepare to move mode or something like that?
Prepare to move mode, yeah. I'm not sure what it does, but it was deemed unsafe.
Well, it probably means the car can roll off by itself, I would guess. Or who knows? Formula E, anything can happen. Maybe that's the artificial intelligence self-driving.
That's when Robo Race comes in, then we're all screwed, aren't we?
Yes, we'll all be sat on the sidelines. On the other hand, they can liven up the game by installing weapons, so it's like a combination of fighting robots and Robo Race.
Bodicias out the sides. I'd like that.
It would be an entertainment. All right, so we've discussed Lotterer. What about some of the other rookies? How did Kobayashi do? I mean, I know there was a lot of excitement about his name, but he was possibly the most unprepared driver Formula E has ever seen.
50 kilometers he had done in that car before he stepped into it in Hong Kong, and that was done on a filming day on a runway, so he wouldn't even have turned a wheel in anger. And those 50 kilometers, that was just to get him to learn the steering wheel. So he came in very, very unprepared, and full credit to him. I think he did an outstanding job. And to have kept it, mostly neat and tidy. I mean, the biggest drama was when he tapped his rear tire against a wall during his qualifying lap. That was the biggest drama. Wasn't actually, all that far off of Antonio's pace in terms of qualifying. The race is a little bit harder to gauge because, and this was true of a few teams actually. In race 2, for example, neither car booted up immediately. So remember how Sam Bird lost the race last year and his second car wouldn't start. That was a little bit more of a plague this year for some teams, and it happened to both of Andretti's cars in race 2.
Right, and if I'm not wrong, we saw several cars also just plain old having to stop on track and reset their battery management system.
Yeah, both Degrassi and Buemi had that in the 2 separate races. That happened to Turvey, which is why he ended up losing the podium. There were a few others. It happened to Engel during practice, Prost during practice, and, it's a little bit more common to see during practice, but in the race, they sort of tend to have it under control. So it is a little bit, it's a bit confusing as to why they're having, so many issues, because the rules aren't all that different. I know we've talked about the extra 10 kilowatts of power, but the teams are basically shrugging that off and saying, we could have even more if you wanted us to, or most of them are anyway. But it's really, I want to know, what are all these teams trying to do that is so complicated? I don't know if they're maybe aiming for a certain amount of efficiency now that the car simply cannot handle, or maybe they're already trying to reach, season 5 targets with a season 4 battery.
Well, you'd think with having to reset the system that it was the software or the algorithms they're using were buggy somehow. They encountered some unforeseen condition that caused them to just seize up and have to be reset. And because it is ultimately an efficiency formula, I know just from thinking about the past years, and Ryan, I'd be curious to hear what you thought about it, because you've actually gone and raced actual cars. It seems to me that one of the biggest issues is the battery and the overheating. And it may be that they are trying to update their algorithms to keep the batteries cooler, because they can store and use more energy that way. And if they've changed significant amounts of code, and that is one of the most customizable parts of the car, then it's not surprising to me that they might have issues in a race that they did not see in testing.
No, I'm not quite sure about this in a racing point of view, but obviously from a production car point of view, a lot of power is found by doing the likes of updates and messing around with ECUs, and potentially if you put too much into forcing upon an ECU, then things are going to start to overheat and start to go wrong. If you apply too much, force or pressure on a certain component, and obviously it's like that with normal combustion engines, but then when electrics get involved, then it's even worse.
I'll take that as a yes. I borrowed that line from Spanner. Sorry, that was very derivative of me. But fortunately for us, he does not listen, so no one tell him. All right, so we're on to the finish of the race. And what happened leading us into race 2? How did we finish and where do we go?
Okay, so the first thing to have noted, for the start of race 2 was Bird's 10-place grid penalty. Almost seemed like he was being penalised twice for the same incident. Although the wording in the steward's report was that, the grid penalty was for having the incident. It's a dangerous driving in the pit lane, and the drive-through was more for the actual completing the pit stop outside of the garage. Or they might have been the other way round, but either way, they were considered 2 separate incidents, which is the point, really.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm just a host, but I gotta say, if he wasn't exceeding the speed limit, how was it dangerous driving on his part? It seems more like to me that the issue was because look, if he was the only person who'd had something happen in the pit lane, I would be like, okay, well, maybe he just waited too long to brake because he was in such a hurry. But he was not the only person to have trouble with the pit lane and with the grip. So it seemed to me more like an issue of dangerous conditions in the pits, because it's not like they get race speed pit stops to practice.
Well, other drivers may have had an issue with it, but how many of them actually, crashed into team members and pit equipment in the end? I mean, Sam was the only one. And, they may not like it, but they're supposed to be some of the finest drivers in the world who can cope with these conditions.
Yeah, well, it was very dusty. I felt that maybe they could have beforehand gone across the pit lane with like a leaf blower or something like that, just to sort of try and clear the dust, because the amount of dust that was there was ridiculous. It was almost as if like a sandstorm had just hit like the day before. But then it also begs the question about pit lane safety, because those people were stood right in the fire of things, and and it was going to happen at some point, having people stood around in the way of things.
I think they are going to do something about it. Certainly, they did not take too kindly to Audi mechanics being in the pit lane a little bit too early, before the last car had entered Parc Fermé at the end of the second race. They slapped them with a €5,000 fine, although compared to what came later, that was not an issue.
All right, then. So let's move on. Tell us about qualifying for race 2.
Okay, well, so we had Rosenqvist doing rather well in qualifying, you may remember. It's his 4th pole position in Formula E. He's got as many pole positions in Sam Bird, and he's been in the sport a third of the time, which is quite astonishing when you think about it, and just goes to show how quick he and that Mahindra have become. But Mitch Evans was a second effort to get his pole position, which he just missed out on, and then actually ended up having his super pole time deleted for being over the energy consumption. And so then that is what eventually ended up putting Eduardo Mortara on the front row. And which, full credit to him, that was already a stunning performance from him, because he's probably gone into that with very little to lose. He's a rookie. No one's going to think any less of him if he does a poor job. And for my money, he's already, on, if not maybe potentially ahead of Engel's level. I think what this maybe has ended up proving is, or maybe it's a theory to consider for this season, is that, your whole race is going to be conditioned by your qualifying and whether you get caught up in, little battles or whether you can get ahead of that. Because if you take race 1, for example, you had so many cars being held up by Turvey that were potentially capable of matching Sam Bird's pace, and yet none of them were able to find a way past.
Yeah, but then to jump ahead a little bit, you clearly had people like Rosenqvist and even Bird able to make forward progress, even on a track as narrow and tight as Hong Kong. So it can't be impossible. No,
impossible. They did say that this is probably one of the harder tracks to overtake on, which is quite surprising, really, when you consider it's got one of the longest straights of the season, out of turn 1 into turn 2, or certainly longer than we usually see in Formula E races. It didn't really matter for Rosenqvist in the end when he blew it at the start.
Yeah, that was a painful thing to see, and he was very fortunate that he collected a 3-wide coming up to that turn, which allowed him to get back in mid-pack instead of having to wait till literally everyone had gone by.
I thought Felix was very overly critical of himself at the end of last season, because we all thought he was a rookie sensation, and he thought, I'm not good enough yet. I've made too many mistakes. And granted, yes, maybe you do chuck it at the scenery a little bit, but you're amazingly quick, and unfortunately it seems like those errors are still there because he didn't really have anyone near him. It was a rolling start for a change because of the issue with the light, that's the start lights, which weren't working for whatever reasons. We had a safety car start, which, if anything, was going to make his life easier into turn one. And, just got caught out by the regen and the brake balance. It obviously happens to the best.
Yeah, well, he did say in an interview, though, that he had been having issues with his brakes all weekend. Did we get any more detail on that?
Not detail. No, unfortunately not. I think this is probably one we're going to end up looking into for the season.
Yeah, well, but again, because of the nature of the way the regen works, it's always going to be an issue balancing it, isn't it?
Well, it ruined Andretti's season, especially DaCosta's. He had issues with the brakes that Robin wasn't, and destroyed his entire season. Many didn't score points in all bar one of the races.
Right. Okay, so we have Rosenqvist conveniently spinning out of the way, gifting the lead to Mortara, who just then sits there.
Yeah, you would have expected Daniel to mount quite a challenge, and, Audi being, it's Audi now, so surely they're going to be the ones to take the win. But, Formula E just keeps surprising us, doesn't it? And, Venturi have had such an incredible turnaround, and the new partnership with HWA, the Mercedes motorsport specialists who are behind all of their success in DTM and GT, and that's a real incredible partnership, and it's going to bring great things in the near future, I think. And you put it in the hands of people like Engel and Mortara, and you're going to do wonders. And it just made it all the more painful, didn't it? When, with 3 laps to go, he just spins it into turn 2, and he hated himself for it. I couldn't put into words the emotion, from that. I mean, it could have been more of a drama than what we saw in Montreal, for example. And he was just absolutely livid, and he admitted it was his mistake. He got too greedy. Tried to push too hard.
Well, he wanted fast lap too, didn't he?
Yeah, he's been talking to Sebastian Vettel too much.
Yes. Well, but, you can't, you're in front, you've got the energy, why not? Well, that's why not. It did look like a bit of a copycat to Rosenqvist too, didn't it?
Well, yeah, rear locking seems to be what people are struggling with. And you made that point about his energy management. How strong was his energy management in his first race? Very little radio communication. It just seems to be a natural talent for him. Or he's worked incredibly hard over it.
Yeah, and it was so frustrating because he was pulling out a gap from Abt. And with 3 laps to go, I actually literally said to myself, he's got this in the bag. And then a couple of corners later, he's spun it. And then the thing that made matters worse is that it looked almost as if he was sort of a bit confused with his steering wheel, trying to get it back into gear and have it the right way up, which lost him some time as well.
I have story time here, actually, because during the race, I was, it got to about lap 40. I thought I better start looking for images for my article. I started looking for one for Mortara, and I had a bit of a panic attack when I realised that I couldn't find any of him from Hong Kong. And then there was a bit of a WhatsApp chat going on between us during the race as well. And not many of you were watching it live because you needed to have Eurosport. And a lot of you were watching it on Channel 5, and I sort of hinted at, you guys are going to be amazed to see who wins this race. No sooner had I pressed send on that message, I looked up from the screen and saw the tyre smoke from Mortara's spin. I felt responsible.
Yeah, it was clearly your fault.
Thanks, that made me feel better about it or anything.
Oh, come on. Now, humor is, the commentator's curse is well known. Anybody could have accidentally caused a rookie race leader to lose his first victory.
It's the journalist jinx.
It truly is.
That's
it is
a new thing,
people. Scientifically, we have now proven this.
That's going to be the new thing. I'm commissioning that, trademarking.
But this is not all the excitement that happened even before the end of the race, because Rosenqvist, he fetched up in about 10th place, 11th place when he got back going again at the beginning. And yet he managed to carve his way up to about 6 when we got to the pit stops.
Yeah, amazing pit stop, I have to say. It was absolutely perfect because he jumped 3 cars, which is astonishing. And, it's the pure contrast of, say, what happened to Antonio Felix da Costa, who came in 4th and wound in 14th instead. because of those car starting issues that I mentioned earlier. So really great pit stop from Mahindra that just turns it all around and picks up the place where Mortara spins. And, a great drive. Really, really great drive. Inherits the win, it has to be said. And that's just really, really lucky for them, basically. But it's the way the cookie crumbles,
Well, this was the interesting thing to me about the pit stops, because as is my wont in watching the races, I'm trying to understand how pit stop strategy can work in one's favor or against one. And I believe it was Mitch Evans, although I could be wrong, wound up basically being trapped by exiting cars due to his garage placement that caused him to get out later. Or it might not have been Evans, but it was one of the front runners that Rosenqvist jumped, who came in on the same lap as him, wound up being trapped by exiting traffic so that he couldn't be released till after Rosenqvist was by. And then, as you said, DaCosta, actually, he stayed out an extra lap, which looked to be perhaps a really good bet because everybody came in on lap 23. But then he couldn't get the car to go, and that was the end of that for him.
Yeah, I mean, on the Rosenqvist bit, I mean, if it was Rosenqvist coming along, it must have been one of the DS cars, or I can't imagine it being a Renault or an Audi because, they're actually, further down the pit lane, and that probably would have played into Felix's favor.
Yeah, I think about 12 people pitted on that same lap, but he was near. They were near enough the front. They would have had to have, their garage would have had to have been after the leaders, and then when they go to be released, they had to wait because they closed the cap. But that is one of the uncertainties of the pit stops, and one of the things that can make it very interesting and risky for the teams strategically.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to take it all into account. And, in these longer races, we are seeing a little bit more convergence on pit strategy because you're having to manage energy a little bit more. Race 2 tends to be 2 laps longer than race 1 when we have these double headers. And that just means you get a traffic jam in the pit lane. You got to take that into account.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see when they choose to come in, but it's also good to see that even at that, their first stints are more than 50% of the race. But even when they're not, like, for example, with Degrassi and his broken suspension on Saturday, he pitted lap 18 and was able to get the car to the end. Granted, not very competitively, but still, that's a huge improvement over what we saw in the first couple of seasons.
Yeah, I mean, no safety car magic for Degrassi in this year's race like he got last year. He transformed his race last year. Didn't have such luck. I mean, it was almost a bit sloppy, Degrassi, wasn't it? I mean, he got into a little bit of contact with Daniel, which is what was more likely to have broken that piece of suspension. And actually, Addy have now admitted that actually it probably was the contact between our two drivers that ended the reigning Formula E champions race. Rather than the contact with Buemi. And Buemi wasn't very happy with Degrassi about his defence because I don't know if you remember Paris last year when Degrassi and DaCosta came together. I believe it was DaCosta anyway. Memory may be failing me there. I remember talking to DaCosta about it after the race, so maybe I'm projecting. But it's a similar defence, quite robust, turning in quite early, blocking the car. And I mean, Buemi was basically saying, "Look, you either give me some space or I'm going to end up in the wall." And it seemed like a bit of a to and a fro there. I mean, there's still not great buds on track, are they?
No, and I don't think they're going to be at the rate things are going because they're occupying the same piece of rapidly shrinking real estate because they're not even in the lead of the championship, and they were the odds-on favorite going into the weekend.
If it were not for Daniel App's disqualification, neither Buemi nor Degrassi would have scored a single point that weekend. Now, how can you not be stunned and amazed by that? I mean, people say Formula E is boring.
I know, but this is just the kind of drama that you want in a motorsport series.
Don't get me wrong. I do think this is going to change. I mean, like I said, I truly believe 7 teams at least have a realistic shot at winning races. I think the season 1 record of 7 different winners is going to be broken this season. I mean, because if you have 17s capable of fighting for wins, that's at least 10 drivers who could win races.
So that said, for all of Apt's driving, at the end of the day, he was disqualified, and for a very, very technical violation.
Yeah, the barcode on the parts in his car did not sync with the parts that they had submitted to the FIA, basically. So they were not running what the FIA had told them to do. And even though those parts were completely identical and were not, it was not a performance game in any way, there's that element of doubt, and they have to be disqualified. There's not a lot you can really do.
Yeah, and Audi came out and said it was a administrative error and not for performance gain. And it's just, such a stupid thing to do, to get the part numbers and barcodes wrong for your parts, and then declare that you've got different part numbers.
But we keep seeing this sort of thing from Apt to Audi, whatever you want to call them. I mean, this is the 3rd race win they've lost in 3 years through a silly error that led to a post-race disqualification. They've cost themselves big points and championships because of it.
Yeah, because previously it was like having cars finish that were underweight by only about the amount that a tub of margarine weighs and stuff like that.
Or the front wing modification in Berlin.
All right, I have a question about this. Did they run different powertrains Saturday and Sunday then? Because this happened in Sunday's race, but not in Saturday's race.
That is a very good question, and one that I do not currently have the answer to. I imagine they have separate parts. I mean, I think Ryan can maybe shed some light on this for us.
I'm wondering whether or not it's something along the lines of like a spot check sort of thing. So they sort of pick out a car and go through it, sort of thing. So maybe that car didn't get picked out the day before, but it was the car that got picked out for the major scrutineering on the Sunday, or something along those lines.
Well, that's also a possibility. I know certainly in Formula One, they don't do all the scrutineering to all the cars all the time. They just pick certain ones to do different tests to. And a couple of them get the very, very thorough checkup, as it were. So that would be an interesting thing to find out if you can, Mr. Journalist, sir.
Yes, I shall get to work on it.
Yeah, I can see you're delighted to have yet another thing to be doing, along with all the other things you're going to be doing. So with Apt disqualified, who was our eventual winner?
Rosenquist. I mean, of all people, who would have done the race that nobody wanted to win? It seemed it was like that race in Monaco back in was it 83 or 86? I was right the first time, 83. Just crazy weekend, really. And Sam Bird, he's ended up leading the championship. And the likes of Renault and Audi are nowhere.
So wait a minute. You're telling me we could have just simply said, pole sitter won the race and been done?
I mean, what makes a far more interesting story, really? It made the race report much better to read.
Yeah, I mean, Rosenquist did do a Riccardo Patrese and spin and then end up winning the race from, the Monaco 83 race. So, you just might as well take the Monaco 83 race and then just sort of swap the names around.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking us through the race weekend. Before we go on to any other business, since it's our first race of the weekend, and since we do cover the whole sport, I've introduced a little section I like to call Hiccups, mostly because I stole it from Stevens. So we've talked about where some teams have dropped the ball. We've talked about where drivers have dropped the ball or the car. But the sport itself, how did it do this weekend? And where are the areas do you see coming in for improvement?
I mean, for me, it's probably going to end up being the media, the coverage in the UK. I know that we spent a lot of last season moaning about UK coverage, and this season we still are, but for different reasons. I I disagree with the idea that Channel 5 aren't showing races live. I mean, as far as I understand it, they are planning on showing the rest of the races live, or certainly at least the European ones, but as far as I'm aware, that's what was in their agreement. But it gets better views at 9 o'clock rather than 7 o'clock, and that's really what it's all about. But I saw a lot of negative comments about Eurosport's coverage, for example. There wasn't, I mean, many positives to take from that. And I mean, as far as I'm aware, they're broadcasting from the UK rather than actually from Hong Kong. So I guess that's issue number one.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen plenty of commentary coming from a studio rather than on site. But from my understanding, from what I saw on social media, a lot of the complaining was about the commentators themselves.
Yeah, they had a pretty they had an experienced commentary team. I believe it was Tom Gaymore and who else was it on the team?
Mike Conway.
Mike Conway. Now, Mike Conway, obviously, he's got his background knowledge from driving in Formula E, and you got Tom Gaymore as the excited sort of commentator. But it seemed, it wasn't like a pairing that went together like a jigsaw puzzle. It sort of felt a bit clunky at times, and it felt like there may have been a few gaps in knowledge and stuff like that. And so it sort of, the commentary sort of broke down.
Korku Anima is agreeing with us in the chat room, and also points out that Channel 5 did up their game, to be fair, which Matt might be a nice time to plug the chat room and the live stream, because you can now catch us on eRadio Show YouTube channel. It's now been officially renamed. It's no longer Missed Apex. Search eRadio Show on YouTube and you can subscribe and get a notification when we go live, which is usually either the day after or a couple of days after the race. And we'll be doing our race reviews, probably a bit of news in between, up until the next race in Marrakesh as well. So do please subscribe, and you can get in on the chat room as well. Join the conversation.
Brilliant plugging. Well done.
Thank you. I tried really hard on that.
I can tell. Hours of effort went into that. But it seemed like to me from the description of it, it wasn't just the chemistry of it. It was just they seemed to be basically unprepared to actually properly commentate on it. They were having a hard time identifying drivers. They were missing on-track action, which, to be fair, having watched the races, the cameras didn't always capture what was happening when it was happening, and the graphics are definitely still sometimes misleading one direction or the other.
I think it doesn't help this season the fact that there's 2, maybe 3 teams that have got color schemes that are very similar. With the blue, you got Renault, you got Andretti, and I believe it's the Neo team. They've both got a light blue, and so when you see like a car stop, and you're like, "Well, is that a Renault? Is it a Neo, or is it an Andretti?" So that was one thing that was a bit.
I do think that Formula E needs to take a more Formula One style approach into its, car identification, because there's actual regulations in Formula One about how you identify your first and second driver. Not just the abbreviations on the car that came in last year, but there's other things about like what color the T-cam should be, what color certain parts of the car should be, and how car numbers are displayed, etc., etc. And I've ended up having to actually make identification notes about a lot of the cars, because each team has got a different way of doing it. And I would say as a viewer, rather than just a journalist, that it makes life unnecessarily difficult. You don't want to have to work hard while you're watching sport. I mean, just for, an example, you've got the 2 Dragon cars who've got 2 completely different color schemes on their cars, much to the FIA's disapproval, apparently. You've got the 2 Andrettis, which are separated by, purple mirrors for one car, different color. Usually it's the roll hoop above the airbox that is the thing to identify with, but a lot of teams use different colors. So Neo, for example, they've got red and yellow. Venturi use red and black, which is just even more confusing. and Piquet's car has got a load of green on it for some reason. So this is not helpful. This is something that needs to be addressed, I feel.
I would agree with you. I think for me, one of the biggest sources of joy is they've started putting the gaps between the cars on the graphics, which is really interesting because unlike Formula One, where they circulate seconds apart, and when people get inside DRS, the action is on. I think in Formula E, it's the exact opposite. They all are very close to each other, and where you see the gaps, there's a train forming, and that's where the action is going to be. So that's where you want to look to see where your overtakes are going to be coming. I just wish they would keep those timings up more, or a longer part of each lap, because there was a lot of battery information and other information that I didn't find to be as useful while I was viewing the race.
I think one hiccup I had was to do with the race restart and the red flag, because obviously it was an incident that was pretty much cleared up and sorted out within like a couple of minutes, and then obviously they had the whole dilemma with some drivers having have done more laps and using more energy than the drivers that got caught up, and so it took best part of half hour till they went back on track and the race was back underway. The thing that I found frustrating was I was hoping to watch the race and then go to work, and I ended up having to miss part of the race and go to work. And then another problem that they had also was that the restart messed up with some of their data. And so I believe it was the teams as well that had this, was that they weren't getting the battery usage percentages through. And so for the whole first stint, we didn't have any percentages coming up on the timing screens.
Right then. The other thing I think that we both can agree was a bit of a hiccup for them. And I know, as always with the Young Series, they're going to be the struggles. But clearly the radio communications between the teams and the drivers needed to have been thought about.
But I mean,
it needs to be thought about it for the future.
But this is a very track-specific issue because of all the skyscrapers you get in Hong Kong.
Yes, exactly. It is a track-specific issue, and this isn't our first visit to this venue, is it?
No, the second.
No. So some accommodation should probably be made for that, I would just say. And then, of course, the other issue, and I don't know if you ever found out what happened, was the lights on the gantry not working for the start of the second race.
Yeah, that's a very unique issue. I've never seen that in any race at all, ever, in any series. I couldn't actually point you in the direction of the problem there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, but it's also, to be fair, these sorts of things, to me at least, are kind of what gives the series its charm, because they are still sort of figuring it all out. And every year it seems to be something slightly different, and they're definitely making progress. So I'm delighted. I'm delighted to see things go wrong, because that's always interesting, isn't it?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, you don't learn anything without making some mistakes along the way, do you?
No, you don't. All right. So before we finish up, any other business?
I would just kind of like to maybe wrap up, as it were, and maybe just point out a few other things. I mean, Venturi, big step up. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they've got for the rest of the season. Jaguar, a missed opportunity, I'd say. And again, looking forward to seeing what they've got for the rest of the season. I'll be surprised if they don't win a race next year. This year, well, it will be next year. It'll be 2018 by the next race. Andretti, have to say, another team that's massively improved. I mean, Da Costa was battling for the podium before the car swap issues, and that to me again is really great to see, because Da Costa is one of the most talented guys in that field, and he was completely wasted last year. And I'd still love to be seeing Robin alongside him in that car as well. But again, we'll see what Blomqvist and Sims do with it later in the year. Neo, for me, are a bit of a question mark, because it seems like it still seems like their biggest strength is the qualifying pace, and the race pace is potentially not quite there yet. They're one of my 3 teams that I don't have down for a race win yet this season. I would love to be proven wrong. Don't get me wrong. Dragon still seems like they're the back markers. The real messy divorce with Faraday future, and doesn't really seem like that they've made any progress, really. I mean, I'm sure they've made some progress, but nowhere near as much as they've needed to get closer to the field. Again, I'd love to be proven wrong. I want to see Dragon back up there. Especially, they had 2 very successful campaigns in the first 2 seasons of Formula E, and, they do belong up the front, as do all the teams, It's not a case of, they just lost because somebody needs to be last. There are underlying issues in that team.
Yeah, well, and I just wonder if it has to do really with the implosion of Faraday, quite frankly, and probably a lack of money and investment that they might have expected to come along with it.
I mean, potentially, we're all still seeking answers for it. I think many people questioned the Faraday decision when it first was announced, and I think those people are being proven right.
Let's go on to our awards. So, Mr. Stevens, what was your thing of the weekend?
My thing of the weekend was finding out that Alex Lynn was asked to lose 3 kilograms before the start of the season. Have you met Alex Lynn? He's a pretty lean guy. There isn't much to him, really. He's a tall guy, but, hats off to him.
Well, as long as they didn't suggest surgery as a means to accomplish it, I guess they were within their rights. What about you, Ryan? What was your thing of the weekend?
Well, the thing is, what I'm thinking of could potentially take all 3 awards, the thing of the weekend, the pony, and the missed apex, and it all pretty much involves Nick Heidfeld. And, obviously, the thing of the weekend and the pony was the whole Lewis Hamilton voicing his comments on an incident that happened 3 years ago, and that was the Nick Heidfeld and Nico Prost accident at the start of the first season, saying the fact that Nico Prost should be banned from taking part in any racing, etc., etc. And I think, is he okay? To which the Formula E paddock sort of trolled Lewis. Formula E with their Twitter did, and then you got a nice video from Nick Heidfeld saying, yeah, it seems like a very, very long time since I was up in the air, but 3 years later, I think I'm feeling okay, something along those lines to Lewis. Thanks for your concern.
My thing of the weekend has to be Vern going backwards across the timing beam to take pole, because how often is that really going to happen? And what an excellent picture it makes. Smoking tires and all. All right, let's move on. Ryan, what was your missed apex award?
My missed apex award was Heidfeld being not only the driver to have the most podiums in Formula 1 without a win, but also the most podiums in Formula E without a win.
Well, hang on. I guess that might be an advantage to having 2 races in a weekend, is the same person can win both awards, right, Chris?
Yeah, I think Nick had a pretty eventful weekend. So I think a shoo-in for this one.
Absolutely. So he's your missed apex as well?
No, my missed apex award is going to go to Jaguar, unfortunately, for the qualifying mishap. It's one of the just basic fundamental errors of motorsport. And that equally could go to Audi as well. But I think, Jaguar, that takes the cake for me.
Yeah, no, missed apex is kind of tricky because there's an awful lot of people who could potentially take it. And Audi would have to be my choice, because such a basic thing, and to have it happen again. And from a team, because we all know Audi from WEC in those just incredibly dominant and amazing years where they ruled the Circuit de la Sarthe, and to then just show up with the wrong barcoded parts. It's just you just want to beat your head against the desk. All right. Do you have a pony award?
My pony award. Blimey, who should this go to? Let's give it to Nick Heidfeld for his comments after race 1. Slalom driving. And it's a great quote. Very headline-ish.
It was indeed. And I love that he was standing right there next to Vern, who was like, whatever.
It was the best thing. Only Jev would have been able to make that look so, like, innocent, you know, because, I mean, to be fair, Jev, you know, I don't think there was too much malice involved in it, but it was perfect defending, really.
It was. What about you, Ryan? Do you have a pony?
So my pony would be Lewis Hamilton, that even though he's not racing and not moaning on team radio, he's still trying to keep it going with moaning over social media about other drivers.
All right, then. And for me, my pony had to be Heidfeld, too. So there it is. Another show in the can. Ryan, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Ferret115. That is IT, not ET. You can also find me on Instagram, also the same, Ferret115. You can find pictures of cars, motor, and anything motor racing related will be on there from what I snap all through the year. And you can also find me on Downforce, talking about other stuff.
Excellent. Stevens, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at cstevens_journo for all my motorsport ramblings. You can find my written work on formulaspy.com. That's Formula 1 and Formula E news. You can find my work occasionally in Autosport magazine as well, and hopefully very soon on .com as well, which would be very exciting as well. And you can also, please do check out Missed Apex podcast, where all three of us have been doing a bit of work recently, and I am sure we will find several ways to fill up the winter, so don't despair.
That's right. And be sure and listen to Spanners, who's, even as we're recording right now, live with Joe Sayward for a season review, part 2, as we speak. As for me, I'm Matt Trumpets, Matt PT55 on the Twitters. Go check out Matt Ragsdale in the City Line Trio's campaign on Indiegogo. Throw me a few shekels, if you will. Make the internet money tree rain so that I can provide you with more of the music that you will hear in Trumpets time in album form. I would appreciate it greatly. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been E-Radio Show.